It is time for questions to the Minister of Finance. Questions 4, 6 and 12 have been withdrawn. I call Owen Tennyson. Minister.
65% of the hospitality sector as a whole is already in receipt of support via the Small Business Rate Relief Scheme. While calls for ever-increasing rate support are prominent, I'm sure the member will appreciate similarly vocal views on how additional support would be funded are harder to solicit. As the member will also know, England is phasing out their particular measure, and the reduction in the retail, hospitality and leisure rate relief from 75% to 40% means that the cost of support is lower in 2025-26. The Executive has received a reduction, therefore, of £58.2 million in 25-26 in relation to business rates. Every pound that we spend on rate relief as an Executive means either reduced revenue for vital public services or higher rates bills for other homes and businesses. In terms of additional support, that would need to have a clear economic rationale. The rating system is our sole devolved tax lever and is there to generate income for the Executive and councils. The member will be aware of the wider funding challenges being faced across Executive departments. I do, however, plan to meet with representatives of the sector, along with other sectors, in coming days to discuss the issues they currently face and how we can work together.
Mr Tennyson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And Minister, that's somewhat of a disappointing response. Whilst I accept that the public finances are constrained, if businesses go to the wall or rates base shrinks, can you commit now to work with the Minister for the Economy and with the Chambers of Commerce across Northern Ireland to bring forward some level of support for hospitality and retail businesses who are struggling on our high streets?
Minister.
I have had significant engagement with businesses, as the member will appreciate. I understand that there are a range of issues facing businesses, a lot of them out with our control in terms of decisions that have been made by the British Government as recently as in the budget statement. I have, like I'm sure other members, had significant correspondence in relation to some of those issues. The fact remains is that in terms of support, non-domestic ratepayers here, some 70% of them receive some form of support, and our finances are limited in terms of what we are able to do in terms of providing additional support. I will always commit to engaging with the sector to understand the challenges that they face and to see if, as an Executive, there is actions that we can take to help support them. But of course, the rating system may not be the most appropriate approach to trying to provide that support. I, of course, am always willing to listen to suggestions that either business organisations or other members have in respect of that.
Armstrong.
Thank you for your answers to the question. Could I ask Minister, please, what progress has been made on rating reform, particularly to help the SME sectors?
Minister.
So I have spoken on a number of occasions that I have brought forward proposals to the Executive in relation to my approach to the rating system and to take a more strategic look at the rating system in the short, medium and longer term. I hope to be communicating more detail to that to members in the near future.
Brogan.
Thank the Minister for her answers there. Can the Minister advise when she shared her rating proposals with her Executive colleagues, please?
I first circulated my proposals for consideration by the Executive on the 10th of October, which included detail on potential consultation for certain rating policy measures. I subsequently asked for my paper to be considered at 4 meetings of the Executive on the 17th of October, the 7th, 11th and 21st of November. I also wrote to colleagues outlining the potential implications of the paper not being tabled to allow for any potential changes to be implemented in April 2025. It's regrettable that despite having cross-party from my own party colleagues from Alliance and from UUP, support to date, that paper has not been tabled for discussion at the Executive. I am not alone in sharing the view that such important matters should be discussed collectively at the Executive. This is evidenced by the cross-party letter which issued asking for my paper to be tabled. Executive discussion, if not agreement, on the general direction of policy was, in my viewpoint, important prior to engaging in further supplementary consultation.
Mark Durkin.
Speaker, Minister, I've been in touch previously about the plight of businesses in Foyle Street in my constituency who have suffered hugely due to protracted works by Northern Ireland Water in the area, and they're seeking relief on their rates bills. The process of revaluation is intrusive and exhausting and expensive for these businesses and labour intensive for LPS. Is there no other mechanism whereby rates can be reduced when the negative impact on these businesses is blatantly obvious?
Mr.
Yeah, and I know the member has raised this issue with me previously, and I am sympathetic to businesses that are being impacted by works that are beyond their control. I know the member will be aware that there is relief in terms of hardship. The hardship scheme that is available to businesses that are suffering from impacts that are beyond their control. But the award of any further relief for specific purposes means that there will be less money to spend on public services, and as I've already mentioned, that's our only revenue generator, and it funds our public services. It's either there's less money to give out, or we put up rate bills for other homes and businesses. Under the rating and valuation system, every case is assessed by LPS on its merits by considering the impact of the work on the NAV of the property, and that is determined by established case law and a long-standing statutory framework that supports the stability of our tax base used to fund central and local government services. And I know the member will appreciate that it is important to have that statutory framework and to consider every case against that, because there will be a lot of demands on LPS in terms of making support available to businesses in difficult circumstances, and so there has to be that framework within which it is considered.
Jerry Carl.
You're not effectively developing a scheme at the minute, but if you were to consider one, would you be considering putting conditions on giving public money, not giving public money to organisations that are hostile to unions, don't pay a real living wage, or use zero-hour contracts? Would you be supportive of those kind of conditions on a public scheme?
Minister.
So I didn't quite catch the first part of the member's question, but I think I got the gist of it. The rating relief is provided to businesses, as I've just outlined to the previous member, on the basis of a statutory framework. In terms of how other government services are procured, some of those issues are already included in our social value procurement framework.
Moving on to Matthew O'Toole.
Question 2, Mr. Speaker.
Financial transaction capital can only be used to provide loans to or equity investment in the private sector. This funding is ring-fenced for this purpose and cannot be used for anything else. It is therefore more challenging for departments to identify suitable projects that advance the Executive's policy aspirations and fulfil the criteria of a loan or equity investment. I have consistently encouraged departments to consider how they can use this funding. My department has agreed with Treasury that any FTC underspends not carried forward under the Budget Exchange Scheme may be used to offset the required repayment of 80% of FTC allocations, thereby using this funding to reduce our future liabilities. I am pleased that following our continued engagement, the level of FTC bids by departments for Budget 25-26 is up on previous years. However, we must still consider all feasible options to use this funding most effectively.
Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you, Minister. While your and your department's approach to FTC has not quite been computer says no, it has been computer says this is quite difficult, so we need to look at it in more detail. I'm afraid we're handing back tens upon tens of millions of pounds every single year in FTC. I offered the example of Tribeca, a part of the northern part of the Belfast City Centre which is falling into dereliction over decades. We could use the FTC for that. You sent me a letter saying, again, it would be difficult but not impossible. Minister, can I ask, rather than simply encourage departments, will your department properly, proactively look at ways that this money can be deployed to improve people's lives, to regenerate towns, to build social houses in Northern Ireland?
Well, Just, I suppose, to correct the point, we don't hand the money back, as I said in the previous answer. It's used to offset future liabilities. It is not obviously our preferred option for how that money would be used, and we would much prefer it if departments were able to identify projects. As I have said, I have been encouraging actively in all of my engagement with ministers, and that has resulted in a significant uplift in terms of the bids that have been made this year. I know the member has made some particular suggestions of his own and has had correspondence back from my department in relation to those, and I am happy to proactively engage with ministers in terms of trying to identify ways that we can better utilise FTC. I do think it's an important revenue stream that has supported development in line with the principles that the Executive has set out.
Steve Egan.
For remarks so far. Minister, as well as FTC, you'll be aware of the fact that Andy Burnham has been able to reach out and look particularly things about the National Wealth Fund and funding from GB Energy. Could I ask the Minister whether she's tasked Neil and his merry bunch of staff to go and talk with people like Andy Burnham to see what we could potentially do with other levels of funding that seems to be there, and Northern Ireland deserves a considerable chunk of these national funds as well. Sure.
And I think the committee has either received correspondence or will be receiving correspondence in relation to the National Wealth Fund and GB Energy, and to give some further detail in relation to that. I have not specifically asked my officials to engage with Andy Burnham, but as you will appreciate, they have regular engagement with Treasury to understand what the outworkings of those funds and how the plans that Treasury might have in relation to those can be utilised to impact positively here as well.
Peter McReynolds.
Thank the Minister for responses to date. Minister, what actions have you taken to use financial transactions capital to support the expansion of green energy?
Minister.
So the member might be aware of the NI Investment Fund, and it uses FTC on behalf of the Executive to support private sector investment. And one of the themes under which developers can access that fund is around decarbonisation, and it's one we'd actually actively encourage further and more interest from private developers, because there has been quite limited interest to date in respect of that, and projects taken forward under that banner. We are keen to encourage more of that, so if the member wants to engage further with officials, I'd be happy for him to do so.
So good.
Number 3.
Sir.
The Department is currently finalising contract terms with Fujitsu for the provision of the new IT land registration solution, which will transform land registry services. The new IT solution will implement a range of new services via digital channels, and customers will be able to submit applications online. Many manual processes will be automated, which will result in an improved quality of service, increased workforce productivity and value for money. It is anticipated the contract will be signed in January 2025, with the implementation phase of the new solution commencing in April 2025.
Ms Sugden.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Does the Minister have any concerns that the Education Authority recently decided not to proceed with the contract with Fujitsu for over £5 million?
Minister.
So I am not over the detail as to why the contract wasn't taken forward between the EA and Fujitsu. As the member will be aware, that public procurement here is regulated through the UK Public Contracts Regulations 2015, and my department conducted a robust and vigorous procurement process, which resulted in Fujitsu being the preferred bidder for the delivery of our new land registration IT solution.
I had no further questions. Call Maurice Bradley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Question 5.
With the Speaker's permission, I will answer questions 5 and 10 together. The Career Opportunities and Promotion Policy sets out the arrangements for temporary promotions in the civil service, including the circumstances they may be considered, eligibility requirements and the selection processes. Temporary promotions are designed primarily to meet business needs and can be required for several different reasons. For example, to cover sick absence, maternity leave, special exercises that are time-bound projects, and to temporarily fill substantive posts vacant for reasons such as resignation and promotion. Based on information provided by our HR services provider, over the course of the last 10 years, the average duration of temporary promotion over this 10-year period is 317 calendar days. Some staff may have been temporarily promoted more than once during that time period. As at the end of October 2024, the majority of temporary promotions, 76%, in the civil service were due to vacant posts and/or resulting backfill. The civil service continues to work to reduce the number of temporary promotions by filling vacancies where possible on a permanent basis through external recruitment competitions. Budget pressures have resulted in recruitment activity for the civil service being curtailed, which has impacted on the use of temporary promotions.
Mr. Bradley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answer. But, Minister, temporary promotions are not intended to last more than 1 year. While there is no strict maximum duration for temporary promotions, prolonged periods from 1 to over 4 years can lead to complications. For instance, if an employee remains in a temporary role for an extended time, they might argue that the temporary position has effectively become their substantive role. Could this potentially lead to claims of implied contractual terms based on custom and practice? And is it not promotion without due process of advertisement of roles, interview and selection processes? And if so, what does the Minister intend doing to rectify this situation?
Okay. Minister.
And I thank the member for his question. As I set out in my original answer, there is policy in place in terms of which temporary promotions are guided by, and an individual's suitability will be assessed under that policy in reference to the selection criteria for the temporary promotion. In all circumstances, if an individual is deemed fit for promotion, if an individual is selected, they must be deemed fit for promotion by their line manager. The policy, the career opportunities and promotion policy, under which temporary promotions falls, is being reviewed as part of a wider review of recruitment policies. But I must say also temporary promotions are still likely to be required as a temporary staffing solution in certain situations.
McGrath.
The Minister says that the civil service is trying to manage this. Well, it's failing it. We have 10% of our civil service on temporary promotion, and that number is increasing year on year. And I worry about the practices that are actually being followed to fill a lot of these positions. There's still a lot of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and there's a job for you. Can the Minister commit to filling the proper ranks with open competition that will be completely fair and give everybody the opportunity to apply for a full-time permanent post?
Sure.
I thank the member for his question, and I suppose I would push back a little bit on his characterisation of how the posts are filled, and I think that proper process is followed in relation to that. The civil service does continue to work to reduce the number of temporary promotions by filling vacancies, just as he said, where possible on a permanent basis through external recruitment competitions. As I mentioned in my opening answer, recent budget pressures have resulted in recruitment activity being curtailed, and that has had an impact on the use of temporary promotions.
Andy Allen.
The Minister will no doubt be aware today is International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and as we speak, the Equality Commission is currently holding their conference in City Hall, Breaking Barriers, Building Futures. And to that end, can the Minister advise what steps her department has taken within the civil service to remove barriers for people with disabilities to be able to take up roles within the civil service?
Yes, and I thank the member for his important question in that respect, and it is an issue that I have discussed with my officials at the highest level in relation to HR and recruitment and support for our existing staff. I do think it's really important that as a civil service, as one of the biggest employers here in the North, that we lead the way and set an example in relation to issues including inclusion and accessibility for people with disabilities. And so that is something that I have actively encouraged, and that we are looking at our policies in relation to how we support current workers, but also removing the barriers to employment. I would be happy for my officials to write to the member in respect of some of the work that is being done, just to set that out for him.
Melissa McHugh.
I thank the member. I hosted a banking roundtable on the 20th of November with a wide range of representatives from the banking industry, financial services union, credit unions, post office, business bodies and the community and voluntary sector. This provided an important platform to discuss key concerns and issues around access to cash and local banking services. I also invited the Chief Executive of the Financial Conduct Authority to the roundtable to hear the views of local stakeholders firsthand and to update attendees on the new rules which came into effect in September this year in relation to access to cash. My officials will be monitoring the impact of the new rules locally and will be sending a summary report setting out the key issues identified at the roundtable to the British Treasury and regulatory authorities for a formal response. I also intend to visit one of the local banking hubs early in the new year to better understand the services that they offer, especially for our most vulnerable in society. And I will continue to engage with stakeholders, including hosting an annual banking roundtable to ensure any local issues are brought to the sector and relevant authorities in Britain.
Mr McHugh.
Thank you, Minister. And could you outline for us, Minister, what your key asks are of the Treasury?
Minister.
A range of issues will be raised in the summary report that we will ask the Treasury to formally respond to. This includes the need to ensure local issues are reflected in its new National Financial Inclusion Strategy, given our relatively higher levels of vulnerability here. As the new access to cash rules do not cover financial advice, I am also keen to understand its plan in that regard to ensure communities can still receive this vital service, which is so important for our most vulnerable. Communities here also need to be made aware of the new rules and how they can submit assessment requests, especially where access to cash is already limited. I am keen to understand what the Treasury is doing to ensure these new rules are effectively communicated here in the North. Treasury will also be asked how non-profit businesses such as charities can be treated fairly under their regulatory regime. This is particularly important when local branches close and understanding of different business models for the voluntary and community sector is lost.
Mr Speaker, and thank the Minister for her answers so far. I welcome the Minister's comment that she's going to be visiting a banking hub in the new year. In my constituency in Kilkead, we had the first banking hub in Northern Ireland and another one's opening this week in Newcastle, which is great news. But one thing that is coming in the feedback from the banking hubs often is that they don't give 24-hour access to cash in terms of cash machines. And I was wondering, has the Minister done any work or have any commitments to promoting the inclusion of cash machines to businesses in rural communities?
And I thank the member for her question, and I wasn't aware the one was opening in Newcastle this week. In relation to that particular issue around access to cash and that 24-hour access to cash, that was one of the issues that was raised as part of the discussion and put forward very strongly by some of the representatives in attendance, including from our community and voluntary sector. I think it's fair to say that the new rules that have been put in place by the FCA only came into effect in September, so there's not been a lot of time to assess their effectiveness as yet. And I think, as I said out already, it's really important that people understand the ability that they have now to ask for assessments around access to cash and that 24-hour access to cash, and ensure that that is available for communities. So I'd be happy if the member wants to write to me and I can get officials just to provide some additional information in relation to that.
Nick Matheson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the Minister for her answers on this issue up to now, and I would certainly say if she wanted to come and visit a banking hub, we have one shortly due to open in Cumber in my constituency where she would be made very welcome. Would the Minister be able to provide any more detail on the sort of policy interventions at executive level that would be useful in terms of supporting retention of high street banking services, particularly in rural areas?
Sure.
Yeah, and I know the member will be aware that we have very limited powers in respect of banking, and the majority of those are reserved, and that is one of the reasons why we hosted this roundtable. It was to get an understanding of the issues, and I have received lots of correspondence and representations from members around access to cash, and particularly in rural areas, and we have strongly conveyed that to both the FCA through my officials to the British Treasury as well. So I think that the roundtable offers an opportunity for those issues to be aired, and it was really good at this time to have the Chief Executive of the FCA in attendance so he could hear the local issues specifically, and he did find that very useful. He reflected that, but I suppose as an executive we are in some respects a conduit to the Treasury in terms of making representations and ensuring that regulations that are being implemented by them and by the FCA are fit for purpose for our people and communities as well, and that's something that I am committed to trying to achieve.
Here.
The British Chancellor announced the Executive's funding envelope for 25-26 in the autumn budget on the 30th of October. The settlement for future years will be announced in spring 2025. I am currently engaging with Executive colleagues on our approach to the 2025-26 budget and have been working at pace to develop proposals. It is my intention, subject to Executive agreement, to publish a draft budget early this month to allow time for a full public consultation before a final budget is agreed by the Executive prior to the start of the new financial year.
Ciara Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for her answer thus far. Is the Minister supportive of ring fencing the agriculture funding that has been baselined for next year?
Minister.
Thank you. And I thank the member for her question. In short, yes. I appreciate the uncertainty, the Chancellor's decision to remove the ring-fenced element of this important funding. It is also disappointing that the amount included in the Executive's baseline did not include an inflationary uplift. I am keen to see appropriate funding being made available to the farming and fisheries communities, and therefore I am very supportive of ring-fencing the agriculture funding, and I will be proposing this when presenting a draft budget for 25-26 to the Executive. Ultimately, however, it will be a decision for the Executive as a whole to take.
Minister.
I met with the DAERA Minister in advance of the budget announcement to discuss the importance of ensuring that adequate agricultural support funding is made available to farmers and land managers here in the North. I also discussed the issue with and wrote to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury to request clarity on the future of the ring-fenced agricultural support funding and requesting that consideration be given to uplifting any allocation for inflation. Unfortunately, an uplift was not included in the budget settlement announced by the British Chancellor, and the agricultural support funding is no longer earmarked by Treasury. Following the Chancellor's budget, the DAERA Minister has written to me setting out his concerns and requesting that Resourcedale, that was previously earmarked by Treasury, is treated as Executive earmarked funding. I appreciate the uncertainty the budget announcement created, and I am keen to see appropriate funding be made available to the farming and fisheries communities, and therefore I am, as I said to the previous member, supportive that the funding for agricultural and fisheries, which had previously been earmarked by the British Government, is similarly earmarked by the Executive in the 25-26 budget. However, this ultimately will be a decision for Executive colleagues.
Mr McLone.
Minister, you did mention there that you had written to ministers. What response did you get from them, or has one been received yet?
In relation to my engagement with the Treasury, I raised it directly in person with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, as well as having written. I can't recall the response off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to correspond with the member in respect of that.
Moving on to and the first name on topical questions is Matthew O'Toole.
Speaker, Minister, in the annex to the Budget Sustainability Plan published with limited impact but much ballyhoo last month or in October, one of the options for raising revenue was £6 million a year from not proceeding with the suspension of hospital car parking charges, a bill brought in, an act brought in by your colleague, the junior minister. Isn't it surreal that a finance minister is scoring as a saving not proceeding with a piece of legislation introduced by her ministerial colleague?
I'm not sure I would characterise it as surreal. I think the member will understand that the annex to the Budget Sustainability Plan, and we discussed this at length at the committee last week, was a requirement under the financial package in terms of raising the £113 million of revenue over the course of 2 years. So any revenue that has been raised either this year or is projected to be raised next year is included in that annex, and that is why that is reflected.
I appreciate the technical response you've just given me, but I think given your reputation for seriousness and detail, you would have to accept that it is a fairly surreal situation for a finance minister to be relying upon suspending the provisions of her ministerial colleague's private member's bill in order to secure savings. You haven't got onto the executive agenda a minor change to the rating system around the domestic rate caps. We haven't seen any proposals as yet, despite elaborate promises on fiscal devolution. Isn't it the case that the big reform agenda that was promised around budget and revenue raising simply hasn't emerged as yet?
Minister.
And again, and I would reflect this, it was simply a case of that is money that is being accrued this year, and that is why it was included. In relation to the broader issues that he raises in respect of rates and fiscal powers, though the fiscal powers piece in particular is part of the discussions around our future fiscal framework. And in relation to issues of income generation, as the member will be aware, that was included in the Budget Sustainability Plan, and the Executive has committed to that regular strategic consideration of our income generation measures. As the member will also appreciate, we are working to quite tight timeframes in terms of the development of our budget for 25-26, and so it was not possible to include that consideration in time for that. But it's certainly a piece of work that the Executive will be continuing to progress, and certainly I, as Finance Minister, will be continuing to progress the negotiations with Treasury around our future fiscal framework.
Trevor Clark.
Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Ministers for answers thus far, in particular her response in relation to ring-fencing budget for struggling farmers. But given that you're minded to do that, Minister, and I welcome that, the Department of Agriculture and Rural Affairs are doing many environmental programmes. Does your department cost those to actually see if there's actually a benefit, or are those just environmentally based and no consideration to either the farmer or savings?
Well, I would say to the member that those are obviously first and foremost for the Agriculture Minister to develop in relation to his business case, and obviously those would have to go through the normal processes of ensuring value for money in respect of departmental spend.
Clark.
And I appreciate what you're saying, Minister, in terms of value for money, but of course, does your department, given that you have the overall responsibility for the budget within the Assembly, does your department do any scrutiny of that to actually find out what the net benefit is to Northern Ireland as a whole, or are these just seen of some sort of environmental schemes that that particular minister wants to push at the detriment to our farmers?
Minister.
And I wouldn't want to be answering on behalf of the Agriculture Minister, so I will try to resist that, but I'm sure he wouldn't be intending to detrimentally impact farmers. But the cases for particular schemes that are developed by any individual department, in this case the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, will be a matter for that department, and it would only be in an instance where a business case was above a certain threshold that it would come to the Department of Finance for consideration in respect of that.
Butler.
Minister is aware that today is International Day of Persons with Disabilities. However, we've seen the civil service fail to set ambitious targets for employment for people with disabilities, with the figure sort of staying stagnant around 5%. Is the Minister happy with this position, or has the Minister taken any steps to increase that figure?
Minister.
And I thank the member for his question, and I had an answer to his colleague a few minutes ago in respect of HR and recruitment policies in respect of people with disabilities, and it is something that I've had considerable engagement with my senior officials in relation to HR and recruitment and supporting of the people who already work for us, and it's something that I am actively encouraging and proactively asking the department to ensure that we are removing barriers for people with disabilities to access employment with the civil service.
Mr. Butler.
Thank the Minister for her answers, and I'm sorry if I missed a previous question in regard to this. Does the Minister agree with me? I think we get it right sometimes when we set things in there to catch people, to ensure that they're not discriminated against, instead of using some form of positive action where we should set targets and we should set the parameters for including people as opposed to trying to stop excluding them.
Minister.
Yeah, and as I said, it's something that I am actually very encouraging of in terms of ensuring that we as an employer, and as I said this to Andy a few minutes ago, I think that as one of the largest employers here, it is important that we lead by example and we set best practice in relation to this, and so I'm actively encouraging officials to look at how we can do exactly that.
Michelle Guy.
Can I ask the Minister, the pooling of budgets is a core element of the Children's Services Cooperation Act. Is your department taking account or taking note of every incident that this is happening across departments?
So the pulling of budgets is something that we actively encourage as part of the budgetary process, and did so again in relation to budget 25-26. I'm not sure that we actively record every instance of where that happens, but as I say, it's something that we do encourage, and if there's further information that the member wants to ask about, that I'd be happy for her to engage with officials in respect of it.
Ms. Guy.
So the Act confers, excuse me, I have a cough situation going on here. The Act confers part on your department to bring forward regulations that would determine how different departments would come together to pool resources. Would you have the intention to bring forward those regulations?
Minister.
So this is something that has been raised with me on a number of occasions, and there is already in place guidance in respect of how departments can do that. And one of the concerns I would have about putting regulations in place is that it may hinder some more innovative solutions coming from departments in terms of how they can work together to tackle particular issues. So as it stands, I feel that there is sufficient scope for departments to work together, but it is something I'm happy to keep under review.
Peter Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Minister if she's had any discussions with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury regarding whether there will be any specific support for doctors' surgeries, dentists and community pharmacies in light of changes to employers' national insurance contributions?
So this is an issue that has been raised considerably with me, as I'm sure it has with other members. I've had correspondence both from public sector partners and community and voluntary organisations who deliver in partnership or on behalf of government, but also from our business sector. And national insurance contributions are going to have a significant impact. In relation to the public sector and those who work in partnership with us, we are still working through quantifying what the costs might be, and we have asked the third sector to share any information or evidence that they have. Officials have been engaging with Treasury, and we intend to progress that engagement in coming days and weeks.
Mr. Martin.
I want to thank the Minister for her answer. Specifically in terms of doctor surgeries, certainly there has been a lot of chat about doctor surgeries in the rest of the UK, sort of saying they can't actually afford to pay this. If Treasury makes a change to what it's said to date around this issue, can I ask the Minister, would we see Barnett consequentials come from any Treasury, say, positive Treasury decision, and would those consequentials be ring-fenced?
Minister.
So no, Barnett consequentials are ring-fenced when they come across, and it is obviously for the executive to decide how it spends any of its money, and that's obviously an important aspect of actually having an executive and ministers locally. In relation to the Barnett consequentials, one of the concerns that I have, and as I'm not alone in having this, the Scottish Finance Minister has been out publicly saying it as well, is that the Barnett consequentials that we are getting for the national insurance contributions for the public sector isn't even going to be enough to cover what our additional costs are going to be in respect of that. So that is why we're trying to get some of that additional information to understand fully what the impact of the costs are going to be, and that's why we're continuing that engagement with Treasury to communicate what the impact is going to be, because I think it's going to be significant.
Mr. Sheehan's not in this place. I call Anya Murphy.
Thank the Minister for her answers thus far. Given the recent hike in insurance costs, is the Minister concerned about these rises and higher premiums?
Minister.
Yes, is the short answer. I'm deeply concerned that the increasing insurance premiums are adding to further financial pressure on households, businesses and communities. My officials and I have been engaging with the insurance sector and the regulatory authorities to identify what is behind these rises and what can be done to control them. It's suggested that increases are being driven by a number of different factors, some of which are being experienced globally due to inflationary pressures in the industry, whilst others appear to be more specific to the market here. I raised my concerns directly with the Chief Executive of the Financial Conduct Authority when we met on the 20th of November. I asked for stronger regulation here in the North, especially in regard to claims management companies, which are already regulated in Britain but not here. On the 19th of November, I also attended a meeting of the Transport Interministerial Group to discuss the work of the new task force on motor insurance led by the Transport Secretary, and I look forward to engaging with her further. I also took the opportunity at that meeting to call for British Government ministers to investigate high home insurance prices, which are also a particular issue here.
Ms Murphy.
Mialga Can Collier, and the Minister answered my question that way. She's also answered my supplementary.
Doug Beattie.
Minister, could you outline the horizon scanning your department's doing in regards to EU laws that will affect Northern Ireland's budget and the funding envelope in future years?
I think the member says EU laws. So there was work, I suppose, undertaken on behalf of the Executive in terms of new EU laws, and obviously the work under the Windsor Framework. In respect of specific laws, the Department officials obviously keep abreast of what is development both in Britain and in the EU to ensure that we are kept appraised of that.
Minister, and thank you for your answer, but clearly laws that are going to happen in the future are going to affect people now. So, for example, in 2030, EU legislation will ban rubber infill on all 3G and 4G pitches. And that's at a huge cost, certainly for setting up 3G, 4G synthetic pitches and for the maintenance post-2030. Have you had any discussions whatsoever to see what packages we can do to provide schools, community groups and sporting organisations to support such?
The short answer is no, I haven't, and it's not an issue that has been specifically brought to my attention. And I suppose in some respects it would be for the Education and Communities Minister within the remit of their responsibilities. I'm happy if the member wants to communicate with officials in respect of that issue to understand what the implications might be.
Michelle McElwain.
Further to my colleague Peter Martin's question, can the Minister clarify whether local government in Northern Ireland will be exempt from the change to the NIC employer contribution, where they are facing an estimate of £12.19 million of a bill?
Minister.
As I said to the member previously, we are concerned that the Barnett consequentials that we got across in relation to the employer national insurance contributions for the public sector won't cover the full remit of the public sector in terms of the additional costs. As the member will be well aware, we face significant budgetary pressures as well in relation to just our general budget, and therefore we are very concerned about the impact that this is going to have on public sector employers. So it's difficult to answer the specific question in relation to who we are going to be able to support in relation to the national insurance contribution costs at this particular point, because we haven't had the figure that we are getting clarified by Treasury as yet, and so we are continuing our engagement with them in respect of trying to understand that, and also in terms of communicating to them the impact it is going to have on public sector, but also the community and voluntary and third sector that work in partnership with us, and the private sector.
Ms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the response from the Minister. But obviously, I'm assuming that their Plan B option is being explored, given the fact that ultimately the burden of this will add to further pressures on the ratepayer. So I'm just curious to see what other plans and options that the Minister is exploring.
Minister.
So in terms of the future plans, or what we are doing, we are, as I said, we are scoping that at the minute in terms of understanding what those costs are going to be, both for the public sector but also more widely than that. And we are continuing our engagement with Treasury, as I have articulated, given the budgetary pressures that we face already, and the fact that we don't believe the Barnett consequentials are going to be enough to cover the increased national insurance contributions for public sector employers. We're very concerned about what the shortfall is going to be in respect of that, and that's what we are engaging with Treasury about.
Thank you. That ends questions to the Minister for Finance. We're going to move on to questions to the Assembly Commission, and I call Mrs Michelle Guy.